All right. Good afternoon. Good evening. It's April 8th, 2020. This is the Economic Justice Law Review's weekly scholarship review. I'm your host. I'm the executive director, Andre L. Smith. You guys may know me as Dre Smith, Smitty Bonton, former law professor at Penn State, Florida International, Widener, and at Howard. And so now what we're doing today, or today and every week, typically on Wednesdays, is we're going to release a weekly scholarship review. Some of you know the Economic Justice Law Review. We don't publish original scholarship. What we're doing is becoming the repository for race economic justice scholarship that's published in all of the journals all around the country, gathering up in one central point, and then talking about them in respect of the framework that I've kind of created or produced as racism as asymmetrical market imperfections. In other words, all racial subjugation or racial subordinating dynamics can be described in economic terms as a degradation of a otherwise, or what we would like to be an otherwise ideal free market, but that free market can't tolerate racism, or I'm sorry, racism is the proof in itself that the market is not free, that asymmetrical market competition, asymmetric market information, asymmetrically distributed transaction costs relating to race, right, reproduce racism. It is how the market participates as a integral part of systemic or structural racism. All right. So that's the framework that we use. But what we do each week is talk about scholarship that has been recently produced and categorize them within that construct. So this week, our featured presentation or our featured article is a fantastic piece by Bernadette Atuahene, who is at the University of Illinois Institute of Technology, IIT, and their law school is better known to most of us as Chicago Kent. Her recent work, Predatory Cities, was published in the California Law Review in 2020. We're also going to talk about two other pieces. Well, not two other pieces, actually. We'll talk briefly about the recent the Supreme Court case that just recently came down in Wisconsin regarding Wisconsin, the RNC versus the DNC, and they're talking about absentee ballots and the election that happened just yesterday. And then we'll also talk very briefly about Ezra Rosser at American is editing a new book called Holes in the Safety Net, Poverty and Federalism, right? So those are our three pieces for this week. The featured presentation is Bernadette Atuahene's Predatory Cities. We'll also talk about RNC versus DNC, the Wisconsin absentee ballot case that was just decided yesterday by the Supreme Court, and very much consistently with the Byron Allen case and Citizens United, and we'll talk about how we'll tie all those cases together. And then also Ezra Rosser's Holes in the Safety Net, Poverty and Federalism in 2019. Last week, I just want to refer to what we did last week. Last week we talked about Beth Colgan. We presented Beth Colgan's Economic Liberty and Criminal Justice. And for me, Beth Colgan's work and Bernadette Atuahene's work are very compatible, even though one is talking about property taxes, and the other is talking about law enforcement obligations, because to me, they're all part of a starve the beast neoconservative program, and I'll try to tie it all together at the end. But last week we did Beth Colgan's Economic Consequences of Criminal Justice Sanctions, or Economic Liberty and Criminal Justice. We talked about Jennifer Pizzio, the importance of diversity and inclusion in healthcare compliance, and then also Nancy Abuda, following the blueprint, how a generation of segregationists is advancing racial gerrymandering. All right, so those were the three we did last week. Beth Colgan is out of UCLA. Jennifer Pizzio is out of University of Toledo, and Nancy Abuda is a fellow at the Southern Poverty Law Center. All right, so some very interesting topics going around, as there are every week. So let's talk first this week about the Supreme Court on voter suppression, or the Supreme Court allowing voter suppression in RNC versus DNC. So basically, our statement as far as the economic justice law review and how it relates to economic justice precisely: voter suppression is a primary method by which society's transaction costs and externalities are asymmetrically distributed by race. Like with Comcast versus NAAAOM, or the National Association of African American Owned Media, the Byron Allen case, the conservative majority insists on a public choice environment in which groups and factions vigorously compete for law and regulation that serves its interest. Right? Civic Republican political programs that ask for black folks to fight on behalf of others unintentionally but unequivocally maintains the racial wealth gap and thus national and global white supremacy. Because again, if we're on the one hand, we would like as critical race theorists, as progressive people, we would like a society where individuals are more concerned about the body politic than they are their individual selves, right? That is the debate or the beef between so-called progressives and so-called neoliberals, right? Neoliberals say, efficiency, individualism. Progressivism tends to want more communitarian approach. But the Supreme Court has insisted, it's one thing to want that, but the Supreme Court has insisted that this environment will be a public choice or a very competitive environment, and that they're going to interpret the laws to allow for groups and factions to fight and compete for regulation and laws that serve that particular group. And we can go all the way back to Citizens United to show or illustrate how deeply this court is committed to this public choice environment where, again, groups and factions, including black folks, are going to have to fight for and compete for law and regulation that serves us. And instead of expecting those others to produce laws and regulation that benefit us when it's not in their interest. Again, this racial realism through Derek Bell recognized this, that interest convergence theory is premised upon public choice theory, that civil rights laws will advance when it is in the interest of blacks and elite whites to do so, right? But closing the racial wealth gap, voter suppression, and all those other things doesn't seem to be in the interest of elite whites at this time, and therefore we're not seeing very many advancements in those areas. Quickly about the case, specifically about the case. Okay, well, straight from the case, the district court's order granting a preliminary injunction is stayed to the extent it requires the state to count absentee ballots postmarked after April 7th, 2020. So April 7th, the election was 2020, and we just saw how, first of all, even before all this coronavirus hit, the city of Milwaukee under Republican leadership, reduced the amount of polling places to something like from 18 to like 2, right? And that's happening all around the country, where polling places are being located far away from where people are living. Same with the state IDs, that the machines malfunction, all of that to discourage people from voting. And so not only do we have that particular circumstance, we also have this coronavirus issue where we're asking people to stay home and and stand 6 months apart. So you would think, if there's anything, you have a global pandemic in which it would only make sense to ask people to stay home and send in absentee ballots, right? So the issue is whether or not the district court had the good sense or not to require the state to allow absentee ballots to be cast after April 7th, so long as they are counted by April 13th, right? Because that was already the rule, that any absentee ballots sent had to be counted by April 15th, or I'm sorry, received by April 13th. So the state legislature already decided. The question was, but does that restrict those ballots that does that only count for ballots that were sent in before April 7th, or does that mean any ballot cast or mailed that arrives before April 13th? So for the people that waited in line, this line is ridiculous. I don't want to waste. I don't want to sacrifice my life. Can I just go home and send in the absentee ballot? The Supreme Court says that the district court overstepped its boundaries. Again, in looking for justice, in thinking about everybody, the court blasted them for, first of all, creating an order that they said was sua sponte, that the court itself thought that this was a better idea and the parties did not necessarily hand it to them. And so this, again, it tells us that this court insists that it is just merely a referee in a blood sport game, whether it's MMA, football, boxing, or what have you. It conceives of itself as just strictly a referee standing in between two fighters, pummeling each other into oblivion. That's how the court sees us as a citizenry, right? So even more from the case, and this is straight from Kavanaugh's opinion, so I'm not even taking from Ginsburg's dissent at this point. Wisconsin has decided to proceed with the elections scheduled for Tuesday, April 7th. All agree that the deadline for the municipal clerks to receive absentee ballots has been extended from Tuesday, April 7th to Monday, April 13th. The state legislature did that. The sole question for the court is whether absentee ballots now must be mailed and postmarked by Election Day, Tuesday, April 7th, as state law would necessarily require, or instead may be mailed and postmarked after Election Day so long as they are received by Monday, April 13th. The district court unilaterally ordered that absentee ballots mailed and postmarked after Election Day still be counted so long as they are received by April 13th. By changing the election rules so close to the election date, and by affording relief that the plaintiffs themselves did not ask for in their preliminary injunction motions, the district court contravened this court's precedents and erred by ordering such relief. And the court doesn't say this specifically, but and they may say later in the case. I haven't parsed the case out like I did the Byron Allen case. But what is an underlying theme of this court when it comes to judicial activism is that the court has to remain subordinate to the legislature. That is something that they just don't talk about when we talk about jurisprudence and democracy. You have three branches of government: an executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial branch. The Constitution does not say which one is superior, and sometimes we call them co-equal branches of government, when that's just not true, especially when it comes to the Supreme Court's conception of it. The Supreme Court conceives of the legislature as the primary, the number one, the preeminent legislative branch, and that the judiciary is third. It has the least significant or the least substantial democratic imprimatur because they're not elected, right? So they conceive of themselves as the least powerful branch. When what? We as black folks or minorities or what have you see the Supreme Court as a co-equal branch of government there to guard against the totalitarianism of majorities, right? About the tyranny of majorities and the protection of insular minorities. But the conservatives on this court say, no, we are referees between parties, peoples, and factions and groups that can beat the snot out of each other just as long as they follow all the other rules of the game. Well, and let's also show that this court says that racism, right, in this case, in the Byron Allen case, the coronavirus in this particular case are of absolutely no consequence to this court. It's not a court of justice. It doesn't take into fact the realities of any situation. It has eschewed or ignored the consequences. So when we talk about statutory interpretation, we can break that down between text, intent, which is formalism, and then purpose and modern dynamics, or the concern for consequences, as realism, right? And the court majority says we don't care about consequences. We don't care about modern dynamics. All we care about is the text and the intent and how you can and allow the people in groups and factions to manipulate them as they might. But as justices and judges, blind to the facts and proud of it, right? Blind to the facts and proud of it. It's interesting that you see Lady Liberty with a blindfold, but you see the goddess Mot out of Africa has her eyes wide open. All right. So to the extent it is not a court of justice, to the extent it only seems to be a referee in a competitive game, it invokes Bob Marley's famous song "Rat Race," right? In the court, and the conservatives are entirely okay with it. Why? Because they have the racial wealth gap. They have the capital to compete and win, right? It's fine to play referee when you know which side is more powerful and to allow them to beat the snot out of each other, right? Or, I'm sorry, one to beat the snot out of the other and just say that it's fair, even if they're of different weight classes, which we are when it comes to the racial wealth gap. All right, let me take a breath. All right, so our second piece that we're going to talk about is a new book that is out or came out actually in 2019, Cambridge University Press. It is edited by Ezra Rosser out of American University in Washington, D.C. Shout out to their dean, Camille Nelson. I think the last academic conference I participated was the National People of Color Conference last year in 2019 at American, and they did a fantastic job of setting that out. And so, in that same year, Professor Rosser has edited a volume called Holes in the Safety Net, Federalism and Poverty. And it has a great deal of authors that have written a lot on this subject. Some new folks, some older folks, and again, as a tax scholar myself, I was hit to this by Francine Littman at UNLV. So shout out to Francine, a great colleague and mentor to everybody in the not just the tax law cipher, but also the poverty law contingent as well. And so my description of it, again, in the framework of asymmetrical market failure, says, to the extent anti-poverty programs attack the racial wealth gap, they address racially asymmetric market competition. Less obviously, they also address racially asymmetric market information available to and about Black people. And also, to the extent money is tethered to politics in terms of speech and poll taxes, anti-poverty programs also combat racially asymmetric transaction costs by facilitating greater and more representative political engagement. Now, when I say that, I guess I'm saying they have the potential to do that. Not all anti-poverty programs are not created equal, but they have the potential to combat economic racism or the racial wealth gap in terms of racially asymmetric competition, racially asymmetric information, and racially asymmetrically distributed transaction costs. A little from the book. I'm not going to read a lot from the book. I'm just going to give you the chapters and some of the wonderful scholars that are involved. And so the book starts with an introduction by Professor Rosser and then follows with 11 chapters, Federalism, Entitlement, and Punishment Across the U.S. Social Welfare State by Wendy Bach, Laboratories of Suffering Toward Democratic Welfare Governance by Monica Bell, Andrea Taverna, Dhruv Agarwal, and Isria Syed, The Difference in Being Poor in Red States versus Blue States, interesting, Michelle Gilman, States' Rights and State Wrongs, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program Work Requirements in Rural America, the SNAP program, and the requirement that you have to work for your food, Rebecca Williams and Lisa Pruitt. State and Local Tax Takeaways by Francine J. Lippman. And that's a huge issue for me because, again, I believe state and local taxation is part of the Starve the Beast program that's transferring the incidence of tax from wealthy and white to poor and Black and exacerbating the racial wealth gap. Sin taxes, And then again, informal state and local taxes like law enforcement obligations. Our next piece, the featured piece, is talking about tax foreclosures, property tax foreclosures in urban areas. So state and local taxes have a big deal when it comes to the racial wealth gap, even though most of us focus primarily on the federal tax code and the rates. Early Childhood Development and the Replication of Poverty by Claire Huntington. States Diverting Funds from the Poor, Daniel Hatcher. States Evolving Role in the SNAP Program, David Super. Federalism in Healthcare Reform by Nicole Huberfeld. Poverty Lawyering in the States, Andrew Hammond, and that's close to my heart, in teaching for third and fourth tier law schools, and students less likely to get hired by the largest law firms. It is my position that we need to facilitate them representing poverty law clients, family law clients, veterans benefits clients, that there needs to be a quasi law degree or a means to represent those clients that costs much less than a traditional law degree, right? So that we have enough lawyers representing those folks, and the system can work as it ought. And Ezra Rosser's Holes in the System is concluded by A Way Forward by Peter Edelman, a very long-time scholar when it comes to poverty law. So big up to Professor Rosser, big up to American University, and I did not know Professor Rosser for over 10 years has been producing a blog somewhat similar to this Economic Justice Law Review blog. So the Economic Justice Program and the Poverty Law blog at American University, big ups to you. And as a matter of fact, that's exactly where I found today's featured article. Right? Today's featured article is by Bernadette, Atuahene, on predatory cities and tax foreclosures. This is Bernadette Atuahene. She teaches again at IIT, Illinois Institute of Technology, otherwise known as Chicago, Kent. It's called Predatory Cities. You can find it in volume 108 of the University of California Law Review, Cal Berkeley Law Review, page 107, 2020. And again, we're talking about tax foreclosures of urban residents and the transfer of those property rights and wealth, potential wealth and capital, to others. Again, and so I write, land dispossession and other racially pretextual wealth deprivations are part of the long-standing yet somewhat publicly imperceptible Straussian neoconservative, regressive and racist program called Starve the Beast, which finds surreptitious ways of transferring the incidence of taxation from wealthy and white to poor and black. Regressive and racist taxation of formal and informal types represent asymmetrically distributed transaction costs relating to race, and exacerbating the racial wealth gap thereby reproduces racially asymmetric market competition, right? And I can speak even more deeply about this. Professor Atuahene is very right about her paper being one of the first to talk about predatory cities as far as tax foreclosures. However, I just emailed her my self-published book on taxes, death, and trouble, and others that are very concerned about these tax programs that are designed to reduce taxes on the wealthy, but raise taxes on the poor, right? That's what we're not really understanding. Even those that know the term starve the beast may not understand that we're starving the beast to save taxes for the wealthy, but the beast is going to eat. And so we're throwing black folks into the belly of the beast, into the jails and the prison systems, and fining them and taking their property to fund it so that the beast does in fact eat, right? And why? It's not just for an abstract purpose. We're seeing here that the coronavirus and the response to it, that this racial wealth gap, this debilitating of black folks through taxation, is designed to create a permanent subordinated class or caste that has to basically take these the most dangerous jobs for the lowest pay, and thereby taking on the highest risk. And as we see right now, black folks are dying way far disproportionately higher than anybody else, because we're the ones that can't avoid public transportation, that we have to are on the front lines or are in essential jobs, that even when it comes to can we afford to isolate and quarantine? Even if you're home, do you have enough space in your home to separate and isolate between each other? All of those things factor in to are you able to pay for caregivers, or do you have to be the caregiver yourself? All of these are factors that are heightening the disproportionality of effect of the coronavirus, and it has everything to do with the expanding racial wealth gap, which is being exacerbated by neoconservative starve the beast programs. Let me read you pieces from her paper. This is her abstract. Between 2011 and 2015, the Wayne County, her focus is on Detroit. Between 2011 and 2015, the Wayne County Treasurer completed the property tax foreclosures process for 1 in 4 properties in Detroit, Michigan. 1 in 4 properties in Detroit, Michigan. No other American city has experienced this elevated rate of property tax foreclosure since the Great Depression. Studies reveal that the city of Detroit systematically and illegally inflated the assessed value of most of its residential properties. And we know this has happened in Philadelphia and other places too, which led to inflated property tax bills unaffordable to many homeowners. Meanwhile, wealthy, and this is my commentary, wealthy gentrifiers are getting tax rebates and and holidays to invest. It's crazy. Then there's also the opportunity zone benefits that wealthier investors are getting. But anyway, back to her paper. Extraordinary tax foreclosure rates and extensive dispossession resulted. Consequently, Detroit has become a predatory city. A new and important sociological concept that this article develops, and I'm in favor of this development. Even more from her paper. Predatory cities are urban areas where public officials systematically take property from residents and transfer it to public coffers, intentionally or unintentionally violating domestic laws or basic human rights. Detroit is not alone. Ferguson, Missouri, New Orleans, Louisiana, and Washington, D.C. are among the other cities where state actors have used illegal methods to augment public coffers. And we can add to that Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and many other places. Although this practice affects many urban areas, U.S. legal scholarship has almost completely overlooked the phenomenon of predatory cities. This article is the first attempt to understand the intersecting economic, social, and political factors that have caused these struggling cities to become predatory. Through an ethnographic study of illegal property tax assessments in Detroit, I find that predatory systems, rather than a few predatory people, initiated and perpetuated the illicit practices. Now, here's where she and I are probably going to disagree, but only slightly. She is going to call it systemic, and I agree that the racial wealth gap is self-fulfilling in when it comes to NIMBY, or not in my black backyard. And it just requires selfishness instead of racism. Secondly, black cities and black majority populations tend to not have wealth, and therefore have lesser control over their cities, and therefore use law enforcement obligations and others to supplement property taxes. However, I disagree to the extent that there are neoconservative actors who operate through subterfuge and surreptitious activities that are promoting a nationwide program towards transferring the incidence of taxation from wealthy and white to poor and black. And I don't think that their presence should be minimized. So back to her points. More specifically, several factors made the city and its residents extremely vulnerable and thus susceptible to predation. Against this backdrop of vulnerability, certain legal and governance failures can create structural opportunities opportunities for predation to advance at scale. Using the Detroit case, this article identifies, defines, and examines the phenomenon of predatory cities, which scholars and policymakers must begin to better understand and address. I agree. And as a matter of fact, this paper I will be using, along with others, Beth Colgan's last week and whatnot, I will be using to produce a second edition of Taxes, Death, and Trouble. How Starve the Beast tax policy created the Black Lives Matter movement. You can find that on Amazon if you're trying to support a brother. More from her paper, though. When Amazon publicly announced that it was searching for a second headquarters, 238 cities placed bids to lure the powerhouse online retailer and capture its promise of jobs and economic prosperity. Many financially desperate cities view investments from companies like Amazon as the only cure to their deeply entrenched economic ills. And again, and we can talk about underfunded pension plans and other things like that are in fact bankrupting these cities that have majority black pop or predominantly or significant, substantial, or even majority black populations. But private sector investment is elusive. With few other options, cities have increasingly sought to raise much-needed revenue from their own residents by increasing parking and traffic citations, passing jail expenditures onto incarcerated populations, and shifting other expenses that once came from the public purse onto private citizens. Again, that is exactly the point I make in Taxes, Death, and Trouble. However, I put it in the framework of the Starve the Beast movement and neoconservatism, including poll taxes, income taxes, etc. Some cities, however, have taken these extractive practices too far. They have become predatory. Predatory cities are urban areas where public officials systematically take property from residents and transfer it to public coffers, intentionally or unintentionally violating domestic laws or basic human rights. This article explores the question, why do some financially desperate cities become predatory? One thing she left out, again, was even civil asset forfeiture, of which the city of Philadelphia is uniquely or extraordinarily guilty of when it comes to using that to raise revenue instead of protect the public safety. Again, one last blurb from her paper. Detroit, however, is not the only city engaging in this particular type of predatory behavior. A recent Pulitzer Prize-nominated Chicago Tribune series found that homes in minority neighborhoods on the south and west sides of Chicago were paying effective tax rates twice as high as those in wealthier, predominantly white neighborhoods on the north side. In addition, the preliminary results of an ongoing study by Christopher Berry show that the most local property tax assessors, not only in Chicago and Detroit, but also in New York City, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Phoenix, Miami, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Boston, and Seattle, are systematically inflating the property tax assessments of poor and minority homeowners in violation of existing laws. In addition to property tax overcharges, judges, police, and other public officials also supplement public budgets by illegally extracting funds from residents. This includes New Orleans judges who jail defendants when they do not have the ability to pay court fees, Ferguson police who engage in unconstitutional policing and issue discriminatory fines, and Washington, D.C. police who abuse civil forfeiture laws. And let's include Philadelphia in that as well. Fiscal austerity endured by economically embattled cities sometimes pushes officials to cut corners and violate laws in order to augment shrinking budgets and replenish public coffers. This is a trend that scholars and policymakers can no longer afford to ignore. Bravo, Professor Atuahene. I could not agree more. Again, Taxes, Death, and Trouble, you can find it on Amazon, and I will be updating it to include this work and several others. Again, we got to understand Starve the Beast, properly understood. If you know Starve the Beast, you know it means cutting taxes, right? So this is all about tax property foreclosures. What is that? How does Starve the Beast relate? Well, again, if we place Starve the Beast within a neoconservative framework, neoconservatives or Straussians believe that a stable society should be run by a small group of aristocratic families, right, backed up by a small number of philosophers, a small number, not the cadre of college degrees that are out there right now, and that the rest are just the vulgar, that basically are not noble, have to be scratching for survival, and that public programs don't help them. There's no point, right? That's what's believed there, that nobility to the vulgar should come through valorous service against others, foreign or domestic, real or manufactured, and that's where race comes in. So you can take, let's say, South Carolina, that's run by, let's say, 200 families, and then a very small number of scholars coming out of Clemson and other private Furman and other institutions, where the rest of the folks are basically just working class, just trying to get along with pretty much no hope to get into the capital class, right? And then amongst them, right, amongst those in the vulgar classes, right, there is this competition between the national fervor of white folks as the salt of the earth against others, minority folks, right? And that those minority folks are then subjugated and made to do the dirty work through the racial wealth gap. So this caste system is implemented through the racial wealth gap, and through the racial wealth gap through informal, regressive, and racist taxation. When we talk about chess instead of checkers, neoconservatives are playing chess instead of checkers. The essence of chess is to make moves that the other side doesn't know the purpose of which until it's absolutely too late. And so using Star of the Beast to create and maintain and exacerbate the racial wealth gap takes 2 or 3 steps to understand, and is therefore chess instead of checkers. Let me just say, Professor Atuahene is a great law professor. Let me big her up. She's a law professor at IIT, Chicago Kent College of Law, and a research professor at the American Bar Foundation. She's written extensively about land dispossession, very similar to another colleague, Thomas Mitchell, right? Howard U graduate, and I think Thomas Mitchell is one of the deans at Texas A&M right now, also a very fantastic scholar dealing with land dispossession amongst African Americans. She has worked as a consultant for the World Bank and the South African Land Claims Commission, and she has also directed and produced an award-winning short documentary film about one South African family's struggle to regain their land. I'm going to have to get that. She has been honored with a Fulbright Fellowship, Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, and Princeton Law's Public Affairs Fellowship. Her first book, We Want What's Ours, Learning from South Africa's Land Restitution Program, in Oxford University Press, is based on 150 interviews she conducted with South Africans dispossessed of their land by the colonial and apartheid government, and who received some form of compensation post-apartheid. So I'm going to have to read that to think a little more deeply or international about reparations and such. In 2015, Professor Atuahene won a National Science Foundation grant for her new book project about land and housing in Detroit. She is the author of several articles leading up to this that I'm going to have to digest and incorporate in the last 2 years, because all of these have been published since I put out Taxes, Death, and Trouble, and I need this in my book for it to be thorough. Taxed Out, Illegal Property Tax Assessments and the Epidemic of Tax Foreclosures in Detroit, which she published in the UC Irvine Law Review last year, 2019. Another piece called State Graft, she published in the Southern California, the USC Law Review in 2018. She also published Our Taxes Are Too Damn High, Institutional Racism, Property Tax Assessments, and the Fair Housing Act in the 112th volume of the Northwestern University Law Review back in 2018. So Professor Atuahene is doing the damn thing. She is publishing in the top journals. She is on the rise. I can't wait to see how well she does in the next years. I can't wait to meet her and actually participate in some conferences with her. I cannot wait to get her work and incorporate it in my book, Taxes, Death, and Trouble, so we can better explain how Starve the Beast tax policy is responsible for the Black Lives Matter movement, right? They're not economics and politics and social property, liberty. It's all tied together. It's all tethered together. So analyzing one without the other, to me, is incomplete. We're going to stop right there. We're going to continue next Wednesday. This is Andre Smith for the Economic Justice Law Review. See you next week.